Hello everyone, I'm Chloe Johnson and welcome to this Fresh Business Thinking webinar series, Lockdown Learning for Businesses, supported by BT. BT Skills for Tomorrow aims to empower businesses and their employees with the digital skills to help grow their business. The Skills for Tomorrow website includes free learning content that small businesses and their employees can access at any time on topics such as promoting your business with online advertising, making sure your customers can find you online, and much more. To find out more, you can click on the link in the comments. Coronavirus has been a real challenge for small businesses and entrepreneurs across the UK. At Fresh Business Thinking, we're used to putting on events, sharing expertise, and encouraging and supporting networking. Throughout the pandemic, we knew this simply couldn't stop. Perhaps more than ever, this is a time when as a business community, we need to come together and support one another. And we're lucky enough to work with organisations and individuals who are passionate about supporting entrepreneurs during this difficult time. One of those is our speaker today, Suzanne Dibble, multi-award-winning business lawyer who has advised multinational corporations, private equity-backed enterprises and household names on billion-pound projects. Since 2010, she has focused on helping small businesses with their day-to-day business law requirements. Today, Suzanne will discuss how embracing the GDPR and the concept of putting privacy at the heart of your organisation can actually give you a competitive advantage. Suzanne will be talking for around 40 minutes and then we'll have some time for a Q&A. If you do have any questions, you can leave them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and we'll do our best to get to them later on in the session. That's all from me for now and I'll pass over to you, Suzanne.
Well, thank you, Chloe, for that introduction and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me on this webinar. I'm very excited to be talking to you today. I do a lot of my own webinars, but it's always nice to be on somebody else's stage, so thank you, Chloe. So today I'm going to be talking about why understanding data privacy, hopefully you already know a little bit about data privacy, and the reason that you're here is so that you can implement it in your marketing in a way that helps but not hinders your marketing. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, but I'm going to be reminding you of the basics of the GDPR and data privacy laws for those of you who may not be quite as hot on that as you maybe should be. But I'm also going to be giving you some really good insider marketing tips. Do have a pen and paper to hand because there will be a lot of actionable things that you can implement that I'll be sharing with you. So I do have some slides for you, so we'll move over to those. Okay, so hopefully you can see the slides. Do shout if you can't. Okay, I'll assume you can and carry on. A quick further introduction about me, because I'm conscious that you might not know who I am. Let me just make sure that clicks through. There we go. So that you can see me hopefully on the video as well, but there is me with my best-selling book, GDPR for Dummies. As of today, it has 84 5-star reviews, which I'm incredibly proud of. Writing the book was actually probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And the thing that drove me on was the thought of helping hundreds of thousands of small business owners around the world with what is a really complex legislation, and making it a comprehensive book, but really easy to understand and implement in your own business. And if the reviews are anything to go by, I've succeeded in that mission. So I'm incredibly proud of the book and indeed the response that it's had. Now, if you're new to this area, or even if you're not actually, we have lots of reviews from data protection officers telling me it's their Bible. But if you're new to this area, then that's one resource that I would suggest that you do go and have a look at. It's on Amazon, it's on discount at the moment, I think it's £17. So for that, and for all of the content in there and how it easily guides you through the steps, that's a really good starting point. I don't say that to make any money out of it, because I don't. The whole reason I wrote it was to help small businesses, and particularly with things like marketing. There's a whole chapter on marketing in the book, breaking it down into the different types of marketing. So that's a really good starting point. I'm also the founder of the largest social media group on the GDPR, which is called GDPR for Online Entrepreneurs, and it's on Facebook. So that's a really great place to go, again, if you're new to this area, or even if you're not and you want to share your thoughts, ask questions. It's a great discussion group I will regularly answer questions in there as well, so you get a free bit of guidance from an expert. There's about, at its peak, it was about 40,000 members strong. So there's always a really engaged discussion going on in there. If you want to join it, do make sure you answer the questions that are designed to filter out the spammers, otherwise we won't let you in. So make sure you answer those 3 questions. I'm Richard Branson's ex-lawyer. I always like to drop that in because, you know, at the end of the day, sometimes it's often perceived as a little bit dull being a lawyer. But I want to share the story about how I parted with Richard Branson on the King's Road, how I went to his home in Holland Park and went for dinner with just him and a couple of others at an exclusive Chelsea restaurant. That kind of livens up my story a little bit. But in all seriousness, it was great working alongside Richard, and he taught me an awful lot. Not least about data protection, actually. That was my first foray into data protection working at Virgin, when I did a group-wide data protection project for the entire Virgin Group. And as a result of that, they shortlisted me, they nominated me for the Solicitor of the Year award, which is hugely prestigious in legal fields. And I was shortlisted and then subsequently voted runner-up in that award. So that was really the first thing that got me really interested in data protection and how it actually affects, in that case, a huge group of companies. I've also worked at ITV. You may remember, it's quite a while ago now, but you may remember when the TV switched from the analog signal to the digital signal. Well, that was a £1 billion contract between ITV and all of its providers, and I led that deal. So a really interesting part of my career was doing that. I was a board member of a £150 million turnover company before age 30. And as a result of that, was included twice in the who's who of Britain's business elite. So if you ever happen to come across those who's who books, you know, they're sort of this thick. So it clearly wasn't just me who was in the who's who of Britain's business elite. I think there were many thousands of us. Do look me up because I'm in there. But anyway, it's a nice thing to have on the CV. Oh, and oh dear, slides going a bit haywire here. Oh, they are. They're not having much fun today. Okay, right. So let's get stuck in because there's a lot to cover. And the very first thing that I want to explain to you, and particularly in the context of marketing, is how privacy law works alongside cookie law, because this is an area that often people misunderstand. Now, I'm sure that you know that on the privacy law side, we have the GDPR. I'm sure you would have had to have lived under a rock if you're in business and you haven't heard of the GDPR. But the GDPR isn't the entire story. You've also got to think about the e-privacy directive as it has been implemented in all of the EU member states. Now, GDPR governs the processing of all personal data, including cookies, and it's not all about consent. Many people often think that when you're talking about marketing particularly, it's all about consent under the GDPR, and that's not the case. There are 6 lawful grounds of processing under the GDPR, and consent is just one of them. Okay, so don't make that mistake. E-privacy, on the other hand, governs the use of cookies specifically, and unsolicited email, text, fax, automated calling, direct marketing. And that regulation is more about information provision and consent. So e-privacy is really all about consent. And the two certainly, well, very much so in the case of marketing, work hand in hand. So you can't just look at one regulation without the other. You have to look at how e-privacy applies as well. And the thing about e-privacy is that, as I said, it's a directive, and that's implemented in each member state's national legislation in a way that gives them a fair bit of discretion as to how it is implemented. So if you are marketing into different EU member states, then you're going to have to look at the laws of each of those member states to see exactly how they have implemented the e-privacy directive. So you might have heard of things like the soft opt-in. That is interpreted slightly differently in different EU member states. You might have heard of the distinction between B2B and B2C marketing. Again, it's introduced slightly differently in different EU member states. Now I'm going to tell you what applies to the UK, but just bear in mind that if you are marketing in a number of EU member states, then you'll need to look at the law of each of those EU member states. Now, in my book, if you want a shortcut, in my book, there is either there's the full table, or else there is a link to the table of the differences in each EU jurisdiction. So that's a good starting point if you do market to those jurisdictions, or you're thinking of expanding your market more internationally, then that's a really good resource for you. Now, just to make sure you're on the right webinar, because you want to be sure that these laws actually apply to you, GDPR applies to all organisations that process personal data of data subjects within the EU. Okay, so if the data subject is within the EU and you're processing that personal data, then the GDPR will apply to you, even if you are established outside of the EU. So if you're in the US, Canada, Australia, South Africa, wherever you might be outside of the EU, then you need to consider whether you're processing personal data of data subjects within the EU, and if you are, the GDPR will apply. Now, you might be thinking, well, what about the UK? Because obviously we have now left the EU. Well, I'm going to be talking a little bit about Brexit and the implications later, but for the current period, for this transition period that we have until the 31st of December of this year, the UK, for data protection purposes, is still deemed to be an EU member state. Okay, so at the moment, nothing has changed in terms of GDPR. There will be slight changes after the 31st of December, and I'm going to tell you about that at the end of this talk. Okay. Now, e-privacy, however, in terms of who that applies to, it applies to all organisations that are established in the EU and those that have equipment that serve cookies in the EU. So there's a chance that if you're outside of the EU, it doesn't necessarily apply to you. However, it was supposed to be amended at the same time that the GDPR came into force in order to, well, make a number of changes, but one of which was to extend the territorial scope of the directive so that it was the same as the GDPR. Now, the amendments are still being heavily negotiated by the European institutions. The changes that they're wanting to make are being heavily lobbied against by the advertising industry. I'll tell you a bit more about that later. So this has been going on now for, what are we now, 2020, so 2 years, and it's not showing any signs of this negotiations ending soon. So I'm not sure entirely when the new e-privacy regulations will come into force. But when they do, it will have the same territorial scope as the GDPR. So if you know that the GDPR applies to you, but you think there's a chance that e-privacy might not, just bear in mind that in the near-ish future, that regulation is also likely to apply to you. So what I want you to take away from that slide is that you can't, certainly in the context of marketing and online marketing, you can't just think about the GDPR. You have to think about the e-privacy directive as implemented in the relevant member state as well. Okay, so before we get really stuck into it, here's what you might be thinking. Well, maybe you're not because you're actually on this webinar, but maybe you've come across other businesses or organisations who think this. You might be thinking, well, why bother complying anyway? Maybe you've updated your privacy notice and you think that will do. Why bother complying anyway? You might be thinking, why is this even relevant to me? You might be thinking, everyone else is ignoring it. My competitors aren't bothering, so why should I? You might be thinking, I've got no time. I'm trying to survive coronavirus here. I really don't have time to look into all of this complex legal stuff. You might be thinking, I think I should be looking into it, but I haven't got the time and I haven't got the money to pay lawyers to look into it for me. You might be thinking, well, I'm just too small an organisation to be fined or even come onto the radar of the regulators. So why do I need to bother? And, even if I do get a fine, it will only be small. And last point there, you might be thinking, and a lot of people do think this actually, you might be thinking, what about Brexit? Most of my website visitors are in the UK, so this isn't even going to be an issue after Brexit. Now, of course, that's not the case. So you might have been thinking all of those thoughts. Why bother complying? Well, I'll tell you why you should be complying, and not just why you should be complying, but also how you can use the GDPR to your competitive advantage. The reason you should comply is because your website users care. So maybe you should care too. Axiom surveyed over 10,000 people in 10 countries, and they asked them on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is not at all concerned and 10 is very concerned, how do you rate your level of concern about the issue of online privacy? And this represents here the percentage of people who answered 7 to 10, i.e. very concerned about the issue of online privacy. And you can see that in the USA, a whopping 82% of people surveyed said that they were very concerned about the issue of online privacy. 81 in Spain, 77 in Canada, 75 in Australia, and even the lowest percentage out of those 10 countries surveyed in the Netherlands was still a significant majority with 65%. And what we're seeing all over internationally is that trust with personal data is becoming increasingly important. Not just that, but complaints are on the up too, so maybe you should care. If we look at the last ICO annual report, complaints doubled in the period after the GDPR came into force. The ICO, for those of you who don't know, stands for Information Commissioner's Office, and that is the regulator for data protection in the UK. Now, the reason for this is that your data subjects, that's your customers, your prospects, even employees, anybody whose personal data you're processing, and we'll come on in a bit to remind you what personal data is, but it's a really wide definition. Certainly name and email address, personal data, lots more as well, we'll come on to that. The reason for this is that data subjects are much savvier about data protection rights now, and they're savvier about what companies should be doing to comply. With GDPR in the news, you know, at the time it came in May 2020, it was on the news all the time. I was doing maybe 2 media interviews a day in the 2 or 3 weeks in the run-up to the GDPR coming into force. And the reason for that obviously was because of the huge increase in the fines, and we'll talk about that in a bit as well. But because of that, and also because the regulators, certainly in the UK and in other countries in Europe, actually did public-facing campaigns to the public, to data subjects, to explain what their rights were. So as a result, data subjects are much more savvy about what you should be doing with their data. And as we saw on the last slide, they're concerned about what you're doing with their data, and they're going to complain if they don't like what you're doing. Now, obviously, the last thing that we want to be doing as small businesses is be on the receiving, well, any business, but particularly as a small business, is be on the receiving end of an investigation by a regulator. And that's what they do. If they receive a complaint, then they have to investigate it. So you really, and that's when they start asking lots of questions, and you realise that actually you're nowhere near compliant. And you know, even if you don't get a fine, having to manage that investigation is very difficult. And there is a chance of a fine, and we'll come on to the other consequences as well in a bit. So it's something that you really want to avoid at all costs, is a complaint to a regulator. In addition to that, exercise of data protection rights are on the up. So whether that's a subject access request where people write to you and say, where did you get my data from? Or whether that's right to be forgotten, where you have to erase certain data about the data subject. There are a number of additional data protection rights that were introduced with the GDPR. And again, people are more knowledgeable about those rights and are more prepared to exercise them. So 64% of organisations in the UK saw a noticeable increase in the exercise of data protection rights. And again, you know, if you don't respond to those data protection rights in the correct manner, in the correct time period, then chances are that data subject is going to follow that up with a complaint to the regulator, and then you will be on the receiving end of an investigation. So you really need to understand, if you don't already, what those data protection rights are, and very importantly, you need to have policies and procedures in place to know how to respond to them. And Even more importantly, you need to be training your staff to recognise a data protection right being exercised, because there is no specific form that these rights need to take. Even if somebody on social media says to you, have you got my data, or you need to delete all my data, then people on your social media need to recognise that and escalate it to the right person. So even if you're using freelancers or agencies to do your social media, then you need to have contractual arrangements with them to ensure that they are properly trained on that and are escalating the exercise of those data protection rights to you. Okay, so you need to be really careful about that. And again, if you're new to this and it's sounding a little bit overwhelming, there's a very full chapter on this in my book, which is probably a very good place to start. It explains what rights there are, the time period you need to respond in, for a subject access request, for example, a lot of people think you have to send them everything. That's not right, and often that can often be quite dangerous for your business. There are certain things you don't need to send to the data subject. So again, make sure you've got the right policies and procedures in place, you know what you're doing, and don't get yourself in any more trouble. Similarly, with the right to be forgotten, you don't have to delete everything. Again, look at the chapter in my book. It'll give you a really good steer on what you need to do and what you don't. And for policies and procedures, I'm going to give you resources at the end, but for those of you who have spent, as I mentioned, various documents throughout this session, you might be thinking, uh-oh, yes, I know I need it, but now I'm going to have to pay a lawyer a fortune to produce it. No, I have a compliance pack that contains all of the documents that you need. It's very affordable, and I'll talk to you about that at the end. Okay, so not just that, not just there's a rise of complaints to the regulator, not just there's an increase in the exercise of data protection rights, but data breaches are on the up too. And this is certainly something that you should care about. If your security and your staff training, because that's where the majority of data breaches arise from, is from employees forgetting to lock their devices or leaving files on the train in a pre-COVID world. Data breaches are really where we're seeing the fines come in. So if you've not yet put in place the appropriate security for your personal data, then you need to look at that as a priority. Data breaches are on the up. I think hackers are getting more determined and more sophisticated. So you need to make sure you've got your online security up to scratch. But equally, as I say, the staff training is key here. So again, make sure that if you haven't already, find a suitable training for your staff. I don't offer them myself, but in my book, I have a list of resources. There is some recommendations in there, and also there is a chapter on how to go about doing staff training. So although I don't actually do it myself, that's a useful starting point to work out what kind of training you actually need for your staff. Now, this is what caused the media interest in the GDPR coming into force in May 2018. Pre-GDPR, the maximum fine for a breach of data protection legislation was €500,000. Now, under the GDPR, that has gone up 40 times to €20 million, or 4% of your worldwide turnover for the last financial year. So if you happen to be watching this webinar and you're the size of Facebook or Amazon or Google, then obviously your maximum fine can be a significant amount higher than €20 million. And indeed, the French Data Protection Authority recently fined Google €50 million. And Facebook, goodness knows what Facebook's going to be fined, because Facebook's being investigated by, I think, every single European regulator. So fines have significantly increased. Now, that doesn't mean to say that for every slight breach, you're going to be fined 20 million. I found this when I set up my Facebook group in the sort of months before GDPR was coming into force. I had people coming into my group, really distraught, saying, I'm going to have to close down my business because I can't afford to pay somebody to implement this for me, but equally I can't take a risk on a 20 million euro fine, because all they'd seen was the headlines in the papers, and they thought they were going to, on the 26th of May, they thought they were going to be fined 20 million euros for a slight non-compliance. And of course, that's not the case. There is not a vast data protection police force that goes around checking everybody's website for a compliant privacy notice and a compliant cookie policy. That's not how it works. Really, your risks are in there being a complaint from a data subject, or what we're seeing more and more of is competitors trying to catch you out and competitors reporting you to the regulator. Do be wary that is happening, and do obviously prioritise compliance with GDPR accordingly. So we've seen that the potential for fines have increased by 40, but actually when we look at the fines that are being levied since the GDPR, what's the position there? Well, we see that fines are on the up as well. France levied 51.1 million euros of fines from May 2018 to 17th of January 2020. Now, a big part of that was the Google fine of 50 million. So that's why it seems so high. But Germany hasn't had massive, one massive fine within that 24 million. So Germany's doing well. The UK is very low on that list, but that's because the two big fines that it levied on British Airways and the Marriott for their data breaches aren't included in that yet, because they were being finalised. But that was a total of 282 million across those two companies. And of course, there's smaller fines as well. But what we've actually been seeing is that it's been taking a while for these fines to come through, because obviously the regulators, their teams have got to get up to speed with what is a very complex regulation. And also, as we saw, the number of complaints has doubled. So they're really fighting it in all directions, and it takes a long time to investigate. So we're certainly going to see more and more fines coming through. But fines aren't the only exposure for organisations that don't comply, because supervisory authorities have a wide range of powers to include other sanctions. And the one that I am probably would be most concerned about myself, and what I'm concerned about for my clients, is the ability to publicly name and shame those organisations that aren't compliant. Now, you really don't want to be on this list, because people talk about it. I talk about it, data protection professionals talk about it. You don't want to be that one, or however many it is, but certainly don't want to be one of the ones that is named and shamed. I often use this very, very small business as my case studies, and he innocently sent the personal data of one person to the wrong person, and he was fined £1,000. So not only as a small business, finding £1,000 out of the blue is quite difficult, but he is now named and often referred to as an example of why people shouldn't be doing that. So you really don't want your business to be associated with that. We all know how hard it is to build a brand. It's even harder to repair a damaged brand. So we really need to think about that. But also, probably even more concerning than that, is that there is an increased risk nowadays of follow-on compensation claims, including group litigation. So I don't know if you noticed it, but around about the time of the British Airways data breach, certainly on Facebook and across social media, there were adverts from lawyers saying, have you been affected by the British Airways data breach? If so, click here and we'll tell you about our no win, no fee group action. And they signed up hundreds of, I'm not sure if it's hundreds of thousands, but certainly a very large number of those hundreds of thousands who were affected to take part in that group litigation. And that is going on as I speak. So you need to be very careful about that as well. So let's just take a step back now and remind ourselves about what is personal data. Well, as I said earlier, it's a very broad definition under the GDPR, and it's pretty much any information that identifies or is capable of identifying an individual. Now, certainly we know that cookies and any other online identifiers are capable of being personal data. Not all cookies will be, but certainly those ones that are capable of identifying an individual are. So you have to be very careful about cookies. And for those of you who maybe you have websites, maybe health and fitness websites, anything like that, weight loss, any therapy, anything like that that is verging on the health area, then you do actually need to be quite careful about using cookies on your website, because that is potentially special category data, or sensitive data it's often called. And for processing special category data, you need to have, well, you need to fall within an exemption, because the general rule is that you can't process special category data unless you fall within an exemption. Okay, so you need to be careful about that. And just as a reminder as to what special category data includes, obviously it includes health and biometric data, as we say there on the slide. And it also includes data about racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, data concerning sex life or sexual orientation. So if you've got a website or you're marketing to people who fall within those categories, then you do need to be concerned about how you're marketing to them, certainly online and using cookies, and think about that a little bit more. Photographs, I'm often asked, are photographs personal data? Well, the answer is it depends. Certainly photographs can be personal data, but it may depend on the purpose as to whether it actually comprises personal data or not. So for example, say you have a photograph of a person, well, a group scene at a sporting event, and people can, you know, the image isn't blurred out, so you can see the faces. If you had a magnifying glass, you could certainly identify the individual, well, in terms of view the individual and see their features. But the purpose of that is to show how well attended that sporting event was. Now, in that context, it wouldn't be personal data. However, if that same photograph is placed on somebody's personnel file because they were supposed to be at work, called in sick, and somebody saw them at that sporting event, then that would be personal data. Okay, so often it will depend on the purpose of the of what it's being used for, as to whether it comprises personal data. Now, if you have an email list and you've got, or a prospect list and a customer list, and you've got name and an email address, that's certainly personal data, and again, a home address as well. Saying that, a name is not necessarily personal data in and of itself if it's a common name like John Smith and you only hold that data, okay, because there are hundreds and millions of John Smiths, and if you didn't have any other data about them and you weren't able to get that data, it wouldn't be personal data in and of itself. And as I said, health and biometric data is an example of special category data, so be careful about that. So, personal data myths, these are very common misconceptions that I'm often asked about. Now, for those marketers who think it's okay to go and scrape websites and that publicly available data is up for grabs and you can do anything you want with that, that is not true. Okay, just because information and personal data is already available, publicly available, doesn't mean that the GDPR doesn't apply to it. It does. You still have to have a lawful ground of processing to use that personal data. Okay, so be wary about that. Private life, the data does not need to be about an individual's private life for the GDPR to apply. It can be personal data about somebody in a professional capacity, for example. That's still very much covered by the GDPR. And a question I often get is, if you're emailing somebody in their professional capacity, does the GDPR apply? Well, this is one of those instances where you need to also think about the e-privacy directive. But if you're emailing somebody like Amanda Smith at widgets.com, and there's only one Amanda Smith at widgets.com, then that is personal data, because that person is identifiable from that email address and then the workplace. So the GDPR applies, you'll need a lawful ground of processing, etc. However, if you're saying, you know, can you just email them out of the blue? Maybe you want to share your products or services and you've come across their email address their work email address on a publicly available site. It's publicly available on maybe an association website or something like that. Then you need to think about the e-privacy directive, and what that says, certainly in the UK, is that you can send unsolicited direct email marketing to corporate subscribers. Okay, so if that person, Amanda Smith, worked at a limited company or a similar corporate entity, then you would be okay sending that prospecting email to Amanda Smith. However, if Amanda Smith was a partnership or a sole trader, she would not be a corporate subscriber, and you would not be able to send her unsolicited direct email marketing without her prior consent. Okay, so a lot of people think B2B marketing, you can prospect as you like, do whatever you want. Not quite true. Limited companies or other corporate entities like LLPs or things like that, then yes, you're probably okay. You still have to think about the GDPR, and you'd probably, your lawful ground of processing would be legitimate interests. We know that legitimate interests is a potential ground for marketing. You'd still have to do your balancing test. I'll come on to that in a little bit, if that's all a bit of gobbledygook for you. But the main directive that you need to think about for unsolicited email marketing is actually the e-privacy directive. And as I say, if it's B2B in the sense that it is a corporate entity, then you're okay sending prospecting emails to them. But you have to be very careful as to whether they're a partnership or a sole trader, because there you would not be okay. All right. If this is all sounding, if you're new to this, if this is sounding a little bit confusing, then again, my book has a really excellent chapter on this. Takes you through it in a lot more detail with lots of examples. So do have a look at that. Personal data can be subjective or objective. If the individual is capable of being identified from that data. So somebody's opinion, for example, can still be personal data and even if it's a wrong opinion, it can still be personal data if it is capable of identifying an individual. So if you're thinking about it in an employment context, for example, then a supervisor's opinion about somebody is very likely to be personal data. Now, you might be aware that there is an exemption for purely personal or household activity, and that is correct. However, you do need to be careful when using that exemption. There was a recent case actually in the Netherlands where a grandmother posted pictures of her grandchildren on Facebook, and the parents asked her to take them down. She said no. So the parents sued her. They took the matter to court, and which makes me ask all kinds of questions about what kind of relationship they had. But aside from that, it went to court, and the court said that, well, the lawyers for the grandma tried to rely on this exemption to say it was purely personal or household activity, but the court said no. The fact that she posted them on Facebook and therefore third parties could access those photos took that outside the realms of that exemption, and she was fined €50 a day until she took them down. So just be careful about relying on that exemption. So let's remind ourselves of the basic principles of GDPR compliance, and then what I'm going to do is look at these in the context of marketing. So the first principle is you have to process personal data in accordance with the law. It has to be lawful. And as I said, there are 6 lawful grounds of processing. So you need to look at your data processing, your personal data processing. So anywhere where you're using personal data, you need to look at that. You need to look at the purpose for which you're processing that personal data. And then you need to think about, well, what's your lawful ground for processing for that purpose? Okay, people often confuse that. You have to think of each purpose. So if you're using personal data in 2 ways, then you need to have a lawful ground of processing for each of those different ways of processing, okay? And you have to be fair. You can't mislead individuals. when you collect their data, certainly. You have to be upfront with them about what you're going to be doing with their data. You have to be transparent with them and provide the mandated information about the processing. Now, you might not have been lucky enough to read Article 13 and 14 of the GDPR, but in those articles is a big long list of all of the information that you need to provide to your data subjects when you're collecting data from them, or if you've received that personal data from a third party. Okay, and that information typically goes in your privacy notice. So if you have cobbled together your own privacy notice, maybe you haven't updated it since GDPR came into force, or even worse, maybe you've copied it from somebody else, that's not a great idea, okay? Because your privacy notice needs to be personal to you. So even if you've used a template, and again, a template is available in my GDPR compliance pack, you need to really think about your data flows, think about what you're doing with the data, where it's coming from, how you're collecting it, what you're doing with it, where are you sending it off to, what's your purpose for processing. You need to think about that in the context of your business, and then use that, that knowledge to personalize your privacy notice and make sure that it really does apply to your business. Because if there's an investigation by a regulatory authority and you've just copied somebody else's privacy notice, that's probably worse than not having one at all. So do not take shortcuts where it comes to having the right privacy notice in place. The next principle is purpose limitation. Only collect and use data for the purpose that you inform the data subject about. So if you've said you're only going to use it to deliver to them the product that they bought, don't then give that to a third party for that third party to market to them, obviously. Data minimization is the third principle. You need to only request the minimum amount of personal data that is necessary for your purpose from your data subject. Okay, so if you only need a name and an email address, then only ask for the name and the email address. You know, you've got to think about things like document retention and making sure that you're deleting documents, etc. You've got to think about security. Minimization is actually a good idea. You really want to have less personal data than more personal data. Of course, make sure you've got enough for your purpose, but you don't want an excess of personal data. Accuracy, you need to make sure that the data that you hold is accurate and up to date. Now, if you have a data privacy dashboard for your data subjects, then brilliant, because they can go in and update their own personal data. But if you don't, if you're a smaller organization and you don't have that sort of technical sophistication, then really you should be emailing your data subjects probably on a 6-monthly basis and saying, if any of your data, personal data has changed, e.g. you've got married, you've moved house recently, you've changed your phone number, then please reply back and let us know and we'll update your records. The next principle is storage limitation, which, as I've already said, you're not allowed to keep personal data for longer than is necessary to achieve the purpose that you informed the individual about. So you should have a document retention policy in place and systems and procedures that go around that to make sure that you don't hold on to personal data longer than you need it. And again, if you're thinking, well, how do I produce a document retention policy? There is one in my GDPR compliance pack with notes, and you can amend that for the purposes of your own business. And finally, very importantly, the principle of integrity and confidentiality, which is where you need to ensure an appropriate security of the personal data. Now, what security measures you will need to take will depend on the nature of the personal data that you're collecting and storing and processing, what you're doing with it, where you're sending it, etc. So it will be unique to every business, and you have to have appropriate security in place. So if you haven't already, then there are some really great government endorsed tools out there, and I always forget the name of it. I'm sure somebody can remind me. It's gone. It's only, I think it's a 2-worder, but basically security experts will come in, they'll do a bit of an audit, and they'll give you a report on all of the areas where you're lacking and make recommendations as to how you bring your security up to scratch. And it costs, I think the most basic, they have a number of different levels. The most basic is sort of like £300-ish. And I can't recall the name of it. So if anybody can share that in the chat box, that would be great. So they're the principles. Now, what does that mean in practice? What are your basics for compliance? Well, as I've already said, you need to firstly identify the personal data that you hold in your business. You need to carry out a data inventory, map your data flows, and record what personal data you collect, where it's stored, how it's secured, what it's used for, where you send it, etc. And again, in my thank you, Cyber Essentials, that's the one. That's the security audit that I was talking about. Thank you. I'm going to write that down for the next time I do this presentation, because that's the second time. I've obviously got a mental block about that. Cyber Essentials, thank you. Okay. Yes, and so for those of you who are thinking, how do I put a data inventory together? Again, there is a template of that in my compliance pack. The next step, once you've done that, is to look at your lawful ground of processing for each processing activity and for, as I said, each purpose. Is it consent? Is it legitimate interest? Is it a contractual ground? Is it something else? The other three are less common. We won't go into those on this. But you need to, on that inventory, actually have that written down. Then you need to think about special category data. And if you're processing that, you need to ensure that you fall within an exemption to the general prohibition of processing special category data. For example, obtain explicit consent. So if you're a spa or a therapist or something like that, and you're working with health data, then you will need to have a specific form of words. And again, that's in my book, in the chapter about special category data, a special form of words that constitutes explicit consent. And if you don't have that, then you are processing that data illegally. So be really careful about that. Just working around anti-clockwise, the next one there, prepare your privacy notice. So once you've done your data inventory, you've worked out your lawful ground of processing, you've thought about special category data, then you can prepare your privacy notice. And again, as I've said, you have to make sure it includes that big long list of things that are mandated by Article 13 or 14 of the GDPR, and make sure that it's a compliant privacy notice, because obviously that's your main public-facing document. And that's certainly one area where if competitors are wanting to trip you up, that's where they'll look and they'll see whether you're, it's the first indication as to whether an organisation is compliant or not. So you really want that to be compliant. Now, a couple of tips about privacy notices. Where does it need to go? Well, I would have it on every page of your website at the bottom, but also at every point where you're collecting data. So if you've got an opt-in box for a special report or a contact form, anything like that, then have a little line at the bottom, just by the box where you're collecting the data, that says something like, we collect and process your data in accordance with our privacy notice, and you would link through to the privacy notice. Now, what you don't want to do is have a tick box and ask people to consent to your privacy notice, because what that's doing is putting the whole of your processing of personal data onto a consent basis, and you don't want to do that, because then you might have other lawful grounds of processing that you want to use because consent isn't appropriate. So I see that in so many organisations, including really big ones who should know better. So make sure that you're not doing that. And the other trap that people fall into is you often see, we never share your data with third parties. That's not correct. I'm sure that you will be sharing data with third parties, whether that is to your email service provider or some kind of cloud-based software. You will be sharing it. What I think you mean to say is, we won't sell your data to third parties so they can spam you. So if that's what you mean, by all means, then say that, if that's what you're using to encourage people to trust you, to give you their data, but otherwise be careful about that. And then the next main document that you need is your cookie policy. And again, this is an area that I see so many organisations get wrong. If you're using non-essential cookies on your website, and that includes analytics cookies, so analytics cookies are not essential, then you need consent for the use of those cookies, whether that is personal data or not, because the privacy directive says that you need consent. And you have to obtain that consent before the cookies are fired. So in all likelihood, you're going to not only need a cookie policy, but also a cookie consent management tool. And I personally use CookieBot, which is affordable and it's nearly compliant. I'm not sure I've yet discovered any cookie tool that is 100% compliant. But what you certainly can't do is, we know now, because the ICO has issued guidance and there's been cases in Europe, we know that continued browsing is not sufficient consent for the use of cookies. So we all used to have banners that said, by continuing to browse this website, you accept cookies. Not okay anymore. Okay, and if you see those websites that have those, then you can write to them and say, just to let you know, your cookie banner is not compliant, and you could be fined. So you need to not do that, and you also need to not have any pre-ticked boxes. So if you have pre-ticked boxes saying, yes, I'm happy for analytics, marketing, etc., not okay. You can't have pre-ticked boxes. There needs to be an affirmative action by the user before you can use cookies. I'm going to have to speed up because time is flying away. Oh, and just actually on that, this is an important point actually, so I will make it, because I had a lot of questions on this when I was delivering a similar talk to this, to the big WordCamp conference. Analytics cookies. Now, even if, so a lot of people know that if you have truly anonymous data, the GDPR doesn't apply to it. Now, that's true. So a lot of people think about cookies just in terms of the GDPR and think, well, if I've got anonymous data, maybe you've used a version of Google Analytics that anonymizes the data, that you don't have to worry about it. That's not true, because under the privacy directive, any non-essential cookies, which includes analytics cookies, needs consent. Okay, so just be careful about that. And also there is slightly different positions on cookies in different EU jurisdictions. So be careful on that. Certainly, I'm absolutely clear on the UK perspective, but there is slight variances, so do check on that. And finally, security. As I've already said, make sure you've got your security up to scratch. Make sure you've got procedures and policies in place for data breaches and notifications, etc. And staff training, again, is absolutely key. So let's look at, in terms of your marketing, let's draw that into the reality of your marketing and how you're going to keep your website users happy, so that they're more likely to buy from you, more likely to consume your content, and very importantly, won't report you to the regulators. So these are my kind of 4 key tips. Firstly, minimize the data that you're collecting. Only collect the data that you really need to achieve your purpose. I don't know about you, but when I go to a website and I want to get some information or whatever, and they're asking me all of these irrelevant questions, I just leave them. I don't want to give them lots of personal data that they don't need, so I'll just go away. So A, I don't think it's very clever marketing, and B, it's actually against the provisions of the GDPR. Now, you might be thinking, but I want to collect more data than an email address and a name, because I want to be able to segment and provide my users with more targeted information. Well, that's fine. The GDPR doesn't say that you can't do that, but what you have to do is be really upfront to your data subjects and explain the benefits of providing more information and what you're going to do with it, and then give them real choice as to whether they want to actually provide that additional information or not. And that leads me to the next big thing, which is to give users real choice and not force them into agreeing to receive marketing emails. Another one of my pet peeves when I'm on a website is, maybe you've seen a report or something, or a bit of information, or you want to click through to another article, and you can't actually get there without agreeing to tick a box to receive marketing. That person doesn't want, well, often they won't proceed anyway, so maybe you've lost that prospect. But GDPR is all about giving users real choice, and to the extent that you're forcing people into providing their consent, that's actually not in compliance with the GDPR. Now, I have lots of questions about this, and they say, hang on a minute, Suzanne, I've just spent months creating this really cool free opt-in that's worth, a lot of money. I've spent a lot of time and effort on it. If I sold it, it'd be X amount, but I want to give it away free to get people onto my email list. Well, you can still do that, but you need to present it in a slightly different way. So what I do, and what the ICO have said is okay to do, is you can incentivize an opt-in. So if you want to get somebody on your newsletter, what you can invite them to do is you say, sign up to my newsletter, and as a free gift, I will give you my X special report. Okay, in the same way that if you are a retail entity, you could say, sign up to my newsletter and we'll give you 15% off your first purchase. In the same way, if you have a special report and that's how you're building your list, then just spin that on the head and invite people to sign up for your newsletter. Be really upfront about what's included in your newsletter, and then you can reward them with the opt-in. Okay, that's a compliant way to do it. Cookie pop-ups, again, a real gripe of mine is to go onto a website and you get this big pop-up that comes in over the entire page, and Yahoo are particularly bad at this. And I've clicked 4 times and I'm still nowhere near working out what who they're going to share my data with, and working out how I can switch off the cookie. And I just leave the site and get really frustrated. So make sure with your cookie notices that you're being clear about how you're what you're doing with that data. And certainly if you're sharing that data with third parties, if you're in an ad tech stack, then make sure that you're really upfront about that and getting all of the proper consents that you need to. All of the regulators across Europe are really looking closely at the ad tech industry at the moment. So if you've got a website and you're using, if you've got ads on your website and you're using, you've got Google ads on there or whatever, then you need to be really careful about this, because it's a hot topic, a hot issue for the regulators at the moment. And the reason that is because, the general public really don't understand the level of surveillance that is happening through cookies. And indeed, the reason that the changes to the e-privacy directive, the reason it's been so delayed is because of the heavy lobbying from the advertising industry. Because what the EU regulators want to do is end this huge under-the-radar surveillance of the general public, who in the main don't really realise the extent to which it's going on. So cookie pop-ups need to be clear. Within one click, people need to see what the choice is, and remember that cookies need to be switched off until consent is actually obtained. So make sure that you're cookie compliant. And then my final point is, well, final on this slide anyway, and I think I'm going to have to skip a few slides because time is cracking on. But do keep the data to yourself once you've received it. Don't share it with third parties without being totally upfront about it, because that is where you're going to see complaints to regulators. A lot of individuals will use special email addresses that just have your business's name in it, so that they can tell whether you've sold that data to a third party, and they'll catch you out that way. So be super careful about that. Now, I do just actually want to talk about this because I have this question a lot, and people say to me, but Suzanne, so hang on a minute, you're saying to me that cookies have to be off by default and people have to take an affirmative step to turn them on. Who on earth is going to click to say yes to cookies? And yes, if you are compliant with cookie law, chances are you're going to lose a lot of people in terms of being able to track them, analytics, etc. So yes, you're going to lose some tracking functionality, but what I think you need to see the bigger picture here, in that regulation is driving away from this invasive surveillance of people. And for me, businesses that are gaining an advantage are those that are thinking about that trend of regulation and are looking at what's coming down the line, and they're moving to different methods of marketing and advertising. So that there are a number of businesses now that are moving towards contextual advertising, rather than behavioural advertising. So behavioural advertising is where, you know, you're using your cookies, you know, you're in a big ad tech stack where all of that information is being combined into this massive, you know, billions of combined preferences, cookies that's making up this big composite profile of your browsing activities, and then targeting you as a result of that. Whereas contextual advertising is ad placement done smartly. So if I'm on a golf website looking at how to improve my golf swing, then there will be a picture of you know, the latest golf driver on there, being advertised on that site. And it's worth noting that conservative estimate is that 615 million people actively block targeted ads. Okay, so people are getting more knowledgeable about this. We don't like it. People are opting out. So, you know, to gain that competitive advantage, I'd be thinking ahead and looking at how you're shifting your advertising model. So very, very quickly on this, for those of you who are in the ad tech stack, if you're using intermediaries such as ad exchanges, DMPs or DSPs, then do check their contracts and work out whether they are a data controller or a data processor, because your obligations for each of you will depend very much on that. If you're not in the ad tech stack, ignore all this because it will be total gobbledygook to you. But if you are, then you need to pay particular attention to this, not least because, as I've said, the regulators are really looking at this industry. And if you need more detail, then my book is a good starting resource. I've got a big chapter on this in there. You need to check that your partners that you're dealing with are GDPR compliant. Be careful if you're using real-time bidding, because that's being challenged as not being compliant. And be careful about the right to be forgotten, because you need to not only delete personal data from your own systems, but also from your partner's systems, and that can often be very tricky. So I've not got time to go into that in more detail, but if you just take away from this slide, if you're in the ad tech stack, if you've got you know, if you're serving ads on your website or you're some other way involved in this, then really critical that you know the ins and outs of the GDPR and how to be compliant. Okay, so marketing hot zones. We don't want you to get burned with your marketing. We want you to have compliant marketing, not lots of complaints about your marketing. And actually, this is, aside from data breaches, marketing is actually the area where we see the most complaints. So you need to be really careful. So just three issues for you to think about here in terms of the marketing hot zones. As I said earlier, the B2B and B2C consent issue is often confused. You need to check the provisions in each EU country relating to the law on unsolicited direct marketing by email, text, fax, or automated calling. Often B2B is more relaxed, as I explained earlier with my Amanda Smith example, but you need to check it in each EU country in which you're marketing to, okay? B2C marketing, you need to be careful about, and certainly if it's online, then generally you're going to need prior consent, unless they are an existing or prior customer, in which case the soft opt-in might apply, and that means that you don't have to get their consent if certain criteria have been met. Those criteria are that at the time that that person opted in, you gave them the right to opt out. On each subsequent communication, you've given them the right to opt out, and that you're contacting them about products or services that are similar to those that they previously bought, okay? And again, that's in the book. If that was a bit too quick for you, then it's all in the book. Legitimate interests. Now, again, I think marketers often think that this legitimate interests ground of processing is the holy grail of marketing. It means that you can completely forget about consent. You can just say, oh, it's legitimate interest. No, no, no. Okay, now we know from the GDPR that yes, you can use legitimate interest to market to people. Certainly postal marketing, yes, legitimate interest is probably fine, but you do need to have carried out a legitimate interest assessment form for each processing activity and keep it on file. That's really where you're balancing your legitimate interest in marketing to somebody against the rights and freedoms of the individual. And there's, again, it's in my compliance pack. There's a whole chapter on it in the book. So if this is new to you, then you can go and check that out there. But what legitimate interests does not take account of is, and what marketers often forget about, is the e-privacy directive for your online marketing. So make sure, always have that in mind as well. Remember that first screen of how the two laws work in tandem. Always think about your e-privacy directive. And then finally, don't forget about your preference list, because many countries in the EU have marketing preference lists. So do screen those lists in advance of sending marketing to them. These people have actually taken a step to opt out of marketing. They're the people that are going to get really annoyed. They're the kind of people that are going to complain. And they're the kind of people that if you market to them, you run a high risk of them complaining to the regulator. So don't forget to check the preference lists. I've not got time to go in. I was going to say a little bit about Facebook marketing and custom audiences. I don't think I've got time to do that, unfortunately, because we are a bit over time already and you might have questions for me. But just a quick one on Brexit. 3 things to be on your radar. In fact, I'm not going to go into this in any more detail. You might want to just take a quick screenshot on your phone of this slide. And I'll tell you some resources at the end where you can follow up on that. But there are things that need to be on your radar. So if you're completely oblivious to the types of things that you need to do following 31st of December this year, then you need to look into that. So finally, how implementing the GDPR can help rather than hinder your marketing and give you that competitive advantage. Trust, really, it's so key at the moment. You know, I have left companies that haven't treated my personal data as they should, companies that are using it in their marketing materials to say that they you know, this is a prime objective of theirs to keep my data secure, etc. They are getting more of my money. And I don't know about you, whether you're doing that with people that you're spending your money with, but certainly I am. And if I am, I know there's lots of other people like me. So increased trust equals more consumers, equals more spondoolies. Yes, that's a technical legal term. And really, you can use this as a market leader. Lots of businesses now are using it as a selling point that you care about your data subjects' privacy. IKEA has just launched a big project around this. And as we all know, IKEA are market leaders in pretty much everything. So, you know, they are, you know, really focusing on this, and as are lots of smaller businesses as well. But you want to avoid brand damage, because data breaches and publicised offences have been shown to really, you know, significantly damage brands. And I didn't have a slide, didn't really have the time to show you the research that has gone into that. But if you're interested, go and research it. There's some really interesting reports on the brand damage that is caused as a result of data breaches or offences being publicised. So we know how hard it is to build a brand. It's even harder to build it up again. Let's not take that risk. We want to avoid complaints. I've shown you that complaints are on the up. It's going to waste your time. It's going to have regulators crawling over things you might not want them to crawl over. It's going to distract you from growing your business. You really want to avoid complaints. You want to save time. You don't want to have to deal with complaints, data breaches, data protection rights, repairing brand damage. You don't want to be fined, even though you might not be fined 20 million. Any level of a fine is a chunk of cash out of your pocket. You don't want civil claims. You don't want those ambulance chasing lawyers who are advertising to individuals on social media to bring a group claim against you. And finally, hopefully, like me, you want to feel good about what you're doing with people's personal data. You want to be treating it in the same way in which you would hope that your personal data would be treated. So on that note, any questions? And before we get onto that, and I'm so apologies that I've run over a little bit. I get very excited when I talk on this topic, but those are the 3 resources that I've mentioned throughout this talk. The first is my Facebook group. There are loads of free resources in there. It's a really good starting place if you're totally new to this area, but also if you have an ongoing interest or ongoing questions. It's not just me in there. There's a really big group of data protection professionals who answer questions and give guidance for free, without, just because they want to help people. So it's a really good group to join and get your questions answered. And if you ask a really vague, general, basic question, then chances are you'll be referred to watch one of the overview trainings. But if you've got a specific question, once you've watched that overview training, then people are very willing to help you out. My GDPR pack is just £197 plus VAT. It's got over 20 documents in there, ton of videos, guidance notes, checklists, you name it, pretty much everything that I could think of to help you easily become compliant. And finally, my book is a really good starting point for getting more to grips with this area. And in there, because I don't want to just give you my resources, in my book there is actually a list of more resources. There's about 4 or 5 pages of resources that from third parties that are really super helpful as well. So hopefully that will help you, because it is a big, complex topic, and you don't want to be going it alone. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for any questions that you have now. I'll be very pleased to answer them. And good luck with wherever you are in your GDPR journey at the moment. As I said, there are resources here to help you. Let's take advantage of them and get you as compliant as you can be in as quick a time as possible.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. That was incredibly informative. We've had some lovely comments come through saying how great the session was, how helpful it was. So let's answer a few quick questions. We've had one from Helen who says, I have a client who is having a company return to work post-lockdown weight loss competition. Will storing the weight of each employee be classed as sensitive personal data?
Well, look, obviously it's whether it's health data or not. And although, you might be able to make an educated guess as to the state of somebody's health if they're clinically obese, for example, then, if somebody is, I think that's the only way in which it possibly could be health data. So if you are, sort of aiming towards obese people and it's for health reasons that you're collecting that data because you want to, provide them with some health related service, then yes, I think that would fall within that category. But if it's more general than that, and if you've got a range of weights, then, I think it would be tricky to infer any health data from that. So I think you need to look at the exact circumstances of that data.
The next one, I'm very early in my business venture. I have seen many adverts on sites like People Per Hour selling emails. Am I allowed to use this data for outreach?
You've got to be very, very careful when buying email lists. It is allowed, but you have to be very, very careful about it. You need to make sure that the person who's selling it to you has thoroughly complied with the GDPR, has obtained all necessary consents. And the problem that we have now is that there was a ruling last year, everything DM is the case if you're interested. And there was a ruling that said that when people are gathering data, they can no longer say, we will share this data with carefully selected third parties. There has to be, the individual organisations have to actually be named. So unless you were named when that data was collected, then it's unlikely that there would be the appropriate consents in place. So it depends what you're going to be doing with that data. Certainly, rules are more relaxed around postal marketing, for example. So you might not necessarily need consent for postal marketing. But certainly for any marketing where you've identified that you need consent as your lawful ground of processing, then the person who's obtained the data needs to have obtained specific consent on your behalf. So you need to be very, very careful about that.
And we'll squeeze in one more. I'm a small business who has only been trading since November 2019. Do I need to hire a data protection officer for GDPR?
It depends is the answer. I'd say the vast majority of small businesses won't need to appoint a data protection officer. If you are a small business who is regularly dealing with special category data, then you might. So if you're a small health practice, for example, you might. need to, but there's a number of criteria as to whether you need to appoint a data protection officer or not. So your first step is to look at what those criteria are, and then in fact, let me try to find the page. I should be able to tell you quite quickly. But generally, obviously, if you're a large company, chances are you will. If you're a small company, then chances are you won't. But there are notable exceptions where very small businesses can require a data protection officer. Let me just find it for you. 2, 3. This is in my book if you need to refer back to it. So I want to say it exactly right for you. Okay, so when your core, this is when it is required, when your core activities consist of regular and systematic monitoring of data subjects on a large scale. So if you are, and annoyingly, there isn't really any guidance as to what on a large scale means. So large number of data subjects impacted as either a large number in total or a percentage of the relevant population. But again, there's been no guidance on what large means. You'd also think about the volume of personal data, the range of different data being processed, the duration of the processing, the permanence of the processing, the geographical extent of the processing. So that's just one of the definitions. The other is when your core activities consist of processing of special categories of personal data on a large scale. But again, no real guidance as to what a large scale means. And then the third one, when an EU member state law requires it. So you might be in an industry where law requires it. But there are a number of organisations where it'd probably be a fine line as to whether you legally need a DPO or not. My guidance would be to err on the side of caution and appoint one. But even if you don't need a DPO as such, then you should absolutely appoint somebody who is responsible for data protection. If it's just you in your organisation, then obviously that's going to be you. But otherwise, you should have somebody in there who's responsible. Even if you're getting advice and guidance from an external source, then there should be somebody who is the main, the main point of contact and who has responsibility for this area in your business.
Suzanne, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the webinar today. I'm sure our audience will agree that was a great session. I have included Suzanne's website in the comments, so if you would like to get in contact with her, then you can do this through the link. Do you have any final words before we sign off?
Well, I'm sorry I didn't leave more time for questions, because I know, I'm normally inundated, so apologies for that. But hopefully that's given you, for those of you who are new to it, some good general principles about the GDPR and more things to think about on the marketing side. And for those of you who do know a lot about the GDPR, I think it's always useful to have these reminders. So, I think I would encourage organisations to get ahead of the game and to really think about this as not a hindrance, but as a way to help your marketing and to really have that competitive advantage.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Our next webinar in the Lockdown Learning for Business series takes place on Thursday, the 2nd of July, with Justice Williams MBE, as she discusses how digital products can create recurrent revenue in your business to help build and scale your brand. If there is anything you'd like to catch up on from today's session, we'll be sending out a replay of the webinar coming at 5 p.m. today. You can find the replay and future webinars at www.freshbusinessthinking.haysummit.com or by clicking on the link in the comments. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you again, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.